Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Kiev and elsewhere in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you this morning, countering Russian threats to global financial security, with an all-star lineup, leading off with the Minister of Finance of Ukraine, Serhiy Marchenko. We also have John Cusack, the founder of Global Coalition for Fighting Financial Crime, Alina Halushka, the co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, Brian O'Toole, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And joining us in a little bit will be Timothy Ash, who's the senior sovereign strategist at Blue Bay Asset Management. Minister Marchenko, over to you for your remarks.
Dear Ambassador, dear guest and audience online, great to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. Before we dive into the details of risk Russia poses to global financial security, I want to thank all of Ukraine's partners and friends for your unwavering support. With your support, we undoubtedly can win this war. Now, I would like to ask you, what do you call someone who speaks like terrorists and behave like terrorists? Correct? A terrorist. But we collectively have failed to acknowledge what risk causes Russia and sanction it as a terrorist state. In the aftermath of Cold War, system of global governance were put in place to protect liberal values, human rights, and the global economy, and to counter the threat of nuclear annihilation. This system allowed us to enjoy an unprecedented period of peace and development. But such a system only works when its members follow the rules. With the violent invasion of Ukraine, widespread support of corruption, and documented financing of terrorism, Russia makes a total mockery of the rules-based international order. And yet, Russia maintains a foothold in the global system. It is doing everything to undermine. Russia sits on the UN Security Council, whose objective is to prevent wars, and it continues to be a member of the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, created to ensure global financial security, prevent money laundering, terrorist financing, and nuclear proliferation. Countless investigations have uncovered Russia's complicity in money laundering, which has only increased after the introduction of wide-ranging sanctions since the full-scale war began. Russia has been found to enable or cooperate with various terrorist groups and blacklisted states, including Wagner Group, Taliban, Hezbollah, and Assad regime, North Korea, and Iran. I will not go into detail about the horrors the Wagner Group actions in Ukraine and across the globe. Their actions have only progressed from worse to worse. We can hear Iranian kamikaze drones occasionally buzzing about my house and the ministry building. We can see their destructive impact on our energy infrastructure as we work to repair the damages. Ukraine's energy sector is already in catastrophic state because of Russia's energy terror. Between 40% and 60% of the energy system has been damaged. As we know, Russia and Iran cooperate on arms and ammunition. Furthermore, Russia appears to cooperate with North Korea. Russian individuals and entities were sanctioned by the United States for supporting North Korean weapons of mass destruction and ballistic program. There are reports that North Korea is aiding Russia in other way to supply the Russian military. These examples barely scratch the surface. Russia is responsible for state-sponsored and criminal cyber threats to critical infrastructure. Its war against Ukraine is worsening the global energy and food crisis, causing great harm across the world, and especially in developing countries. Russia is not simply undermining the global economic system. It's holding us all to ransom. In November last year, the European Parliament recognized Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism and as a state that uses means of terrorism. European Union member states have put in place their own legal frameworks. Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland amended national legislation and designed either Russia or Wagner Group as terrorists. The United States designed Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization, freezing its US assets. More must be done. This month, FATF members will gather in Paris to consider further measures against Russia on a symbolic date, especially exactly 1 year since the Russia barbaric invasion. FATF should spell out the risk Russia possesses, exclude Russia, and blacklist it. This is arguably the most effective tool for restricting terrorist access to the global economy. It forces all states and companies to apply enhanced due diligence to any transaction with the financial system of a blacklisted jurisdiction. This will significantly increase the cost of doing business with Russia and effectively choke Putin's ability to finance his illegal war of aggression. Just as important, it will help us create a safer and more resilient global financial system in the long term. The European Union, G7, and other nations committed to a rules-based international order should urgently recognize the risk Russia poses to the integrity of the global financial system. They must also act to put Russia on their respective high-risk jurisdictions, issue relevant markets guidance, and enhance their national financial crime regulation to counter Russia's threats. For too long, Russia has been allowed to undermine the system from inside. The rules-based international order can only survive if violators are held accountable, no matter their size or the size of their oil and gas reserves. We have powerful mechanisms available to enforce these rules. The time has come to use them. We must show that Russian terrorism, a brazen attempt to destroy the rules-based international order, will not be tolerated. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me again. Thank you.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for that presentation. As you point out, the United States is not at this point interested in labeling, or has not decided yet to label Russia a state terrorist government. I hear two arguments from the administration explaining this reluctance. One is that under our laws, if Russia were designated a terrorist state, that would mean that many people in the United States might have a claim on Russian assets and compensation for Russian activities, whereas the administration would like to use those frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine sustain its economy and also to rebuild. So that's reason one. Reason two, which they never offer, but we know is there, is that general hesitancy to boldly strike at Russia even as it conducts its war in Ukraine. We see that on the supply of weapons. We see that here too. So what do you say to these two possible reasons for administration reluctance to label Russia a terrorist state?
It's a good question. I know that the United States is only try to deal using back on Ukraine's interests. So they solely interested in Ukraine's activities and how to prevent damages. And of course, I think that the risks you mentioned can be mitigated and can be prevented. But what my message could be, to put Russia on as a terrorist state provides much more greater opportunity for us because it damage the most precious thing they have right now, the time. They lost this precious thing, they lost time, and they could be devastated as a economy, as a state in a much faster manner than it is. So I see this as a possibility, not just an action, but I see this possibility can be used, and your risk you mentioned can be mitigated using existing legislation.
Okay, thank you. One more question before we turn to our panel. You talked a little bit about the problem with grain, Moscow's blocking for forced theft of Ukrainian grain and resale of it elsewhere. And then, of course, it's blocking of Ukraine's ability to export, although we have a deal worked out with the UN and Turks. What else would you like to see happen to ensure Ukrainian grain can move unimpeded to world markets, especially to the global south?
Of course, our key aim is to help us to open these sea roads for all commodities which can be which can come from Ukraine. So to before the war, seaports in the Black Sea were one of the most powerful channel to export commodity for other countries. That's why for us it's important to unblock and to help other commodities to travel through this channel. And I think that this incentive has shown that it's possible using intermediation of third countries, and I think it's a way forward in dealing with Russia aggressor as a state to prevent them to block grain from export from Ukraine as other commodities.
I'm sure you noticed that recently, for the first time since Moscow's big invasion, a U.S. Navy ship made it almost into the Black Sea, or sort of into the Black Sea. It was in the Sea of Marmara. Are you hoping for a reappearance of American and NATO naval power in the Black Sea?
You know, we are. I try to avoid the question which I'm not fully responsible. So
That's fine. I didn't mean to ambush you, but I thought it was an interesting development.
For finances. So, of course, I understand that NATO countries are eager to prevent them to be part of this conflict, and we really understand this, and that's why we believe that we can solve and win this war using powerful support from our NATO allies. And I think it could be their choice either to help us to protect our incentives or provide us with necessary armors, weapons, hard ammunitions, etc., to help us to win this war. That's why I will try to give floors to NATO nations to decide how to deal with Russia.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Minister. You're welcome to stay with us, but we'll now turn to our panelists. All right. Mr. Cusack, you founded the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime. You've been a real leader in this area. What in particular concerns you about Kremlin activities in the financial area?
Thanks very much. Hopefully you can all hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. So,
loud and clear.
Look, Russia's been gaming the international financial system for more than 2 decades. I don't think that's a very controversial thing to say. But it has really become transparent that that Russia has benefited from being part of the club, being a FATF member, and actually former, let's not forget, FATF president back in early parts of this decade, would you believe? Because actually it does some things very effectively, like going after people that they don't like having probably the biggest FIU in the world with 800 people compared to 250 in the US, like targeting individuals and sharing information in a way that we all would like to share information, but not at the the levels of without controls and safeguards that they do in Russia. And the FIU head, who was the former president of FATF, let's not forget, was a former member of the KGB and has physical meetings with President Putin on a monthly basis. Think about the head of FinCEN getting close to the president. Never is going to happen. So Russia was able to game the system because it looked as though it was doing certain things well. And of course, it was doing certain things well, but it only doing certain things that it wanted to do, wanted to be successful doing. It's an autocratic regime and a criminal enterprise. Now, it's not the only one, but it's probably the only one that's as large, and it's the only one that's been at it for very, very long. A couple of other things. When you get an autocratic criminal enterprise with corruption at the levels that corruption we've seen in Russia, then you get the problems that we're all well aware of. And we see $1 trillion in 2 decades being laundered from the east through to the west, and all that money, of course, coming via circuitous routes and laundromats, which are classic money laundering techniques, which are using lack of transparency, offshore companies, and significant enablers in order to be able to move that money and to benefit from that money. We've all got to wake up to the fact that these kinds of activities undermine all of us. And whilst they may benefit short term in the West, some of the economies, of course, the underlying elements here are either at best capital flight, which is some of it, at best tax evasion, which is some of it, but of course, a lot of it is criminal money, organized criminal money, and corrupt funds. And that's what's been going on for the last 2 decades. And now for many people, we've woken up and we've seen what we truly had, and we need to react to that. Now, the problem with, FATF is not, it's not a Western organization, albeit it's based in Paris. It is a collective of many countries around the world. It's a task force to combat financial crime, but it's very difficult to have a task force that financial crime to tackle financial crime. You've got a member which is autocratic and a criminal enterprise. That would seem to me to be inconsistent with the purpose of the organization. But once you start talking about governments, it's then very difficult. We also have lots of views about lots of different governments, including our own. Frankly, when it comes to the fight against financial crime, we can all do better.
Thank you. All right, Elena Halushka, you are the co-founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory and a longtime civil society activist. You've watched Russia conduct numerous war crimes over the past 9 years, and especially since the February 2022 offensive. This includes targeted attacks on civilians, civilian infrastructure, rape, abduction of children. What is Ukraine doing to keep track of these crimes to eventually bring Russian war criminals to justice?
Dear Ambassador Herbst, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to be here. And while answering your question, I would probably echo very much what our Minister Marchenko said, because if you take a look at Russia's actions and activities in Ukraine, that's pure large-scale terrorism. So they are they are destroying houses, residential buildings, hospitals, schools, targeting particularly bomb shelters, civilians, shooting evacuation convoys, killing medics. This is absolutely no less different from what ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or Hezbollah are or were doing. But Russia went even further, and they are creating a very dangerous precedent which regards the nuclear terrorism at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that they have militarized the power plant. They are torturing employees who are running the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. And they are basically threatening the nuclear security and safety of entire Europe, far beyond Ukrainian borders. What we have to do, Ambassador, you're absolutely right. We need to keep an eye. We need to keep a record on Russian atrocities, on Russian destructions. And I know that Ukrainian government has been doing that. I know that several think tanks, such as Kyiv School of Economics. I also know that it's incredibly important to communicate this message with the world in order to keep the international solidarity with Ukraine and in order to counter Russian propaganda as well. However, I think that it's incredibly important to be also thinking and talking what we can do to stop this terrorism, to make sure that we do not need to keep records of it because it is not happening. And here, obviously, number one task is maximum weapons for Ukraine. We are seeing tank coalition. We are grateful, but there is a commitment for 100 modern tanks. That's not enough. According to Zelensky, we need maximum 500. So we call on the Western countries to scale up and step in their participation in the tank coalition. We also need long-range missiles and modern fighter jets as F-16, which will be the next biggest goal of our defense assistance advocacy. It's incredibly important that Russian private armies, the most popular of which is Wagner Group, but not only it, are recognized as terrorist organizations, and Russia is recognized as state sponsor of terrorism. We know that there are legitimate concerns, which you, Ambassador, have already voiced, but that could be fixed by amending the legislation, which gives the priority for Ukraine or for those who will be representing Ukrainian interests, for example, as the Department of Justice, to have the priority in the courts while they will be confiscating those assets. And hearing the argument that, hey, this will pave the way for other people to confiscate assets and doing nothing for 11 months, this is not the way which we have to move forward with this question. So much more decisive actions are needed now. Blacklisting Russia in the FATF, that's incredibly important because it would help to sanction all of other bank and financial institutions not subject to Western sanctions, and that will also have the secondary sanction effect, and that would close the loopholes for Russia to circumvent existing sanctions, which unfortunately are still existing. It's important to sanction Rosatom because Rosatom is the tool and instruments for the Russian nuclear terrorism, and they are actually those who are endangering the nuclear security of entire continent. Also, it's important to close the loopholes through which Western made components, such as, for example, microchips, are ending in Russian or Iranian weapons, which are killing us Ukrainians. You've said about the grain deal and about the food security, global food security, which is also one of the tools of Russian terrorism, but not only against Ukraine, but against the entire world. It's important to keep the secure tracks, secure paths for the exports of grain, but that's not the only thing. We have to be speaking already about the next planting season in Ukraine. Most of the lands are agricultural lands are in the east and in the south of the country, where the active military actions are happening right now, or those territories which have been heavily mined. So a lot needs to be done, as well as economic support for Ukrainian farmers to make sure that they have enough funds they can economically sustain the next planting season, as well as demining, as well as the stop of the hostilities and the liberation of those territories. When we get all those things in place, we would have less work with regards to taking the records of the Russian atrocities and crimes.
Thank you. Very comprehensive answer. Okay, we've been joined by Tim Ash. Mr. Ash, you've been a close and well-informed observer of Russia's war on Ukraine, and you're also a world-class economist. The Kremlin has proved ingenious in using all weapons in its arsenal, hybrid, military, financial, informational, in pursuing this war. What financial weapons has Moscow used most effectively in pursuit of its revisionist objectives?
Well, thank you for inviting me to the session today. Apologies, I had a prior engagement that I couldn't get out of for the earlier start to the session, so I'm sorry about that. I guess now with hindsight, I mean, the starting point would be, what is clear is that, you know, Russian actions, Putin's actions in Ukraine were planned many years ahead, and you know, this idea of fortress Russia, right? There's a lot of focus on the fact that maybe in the past year sanctions have not been as effective as they could have been. You know, they haven't perhaps crash the Russian economy as aggressively as people assume. But I mean, the reality is that that was because Russia built up its defenses, right? I mean, it deleveraged, it reduced its vulnerability on global capital markets. It built its reserves to 600 billion or close to that. Putin knew he was going to do that, and he prepared his defenses, right? And that's made Russia more durable over the last year than I think many people expected. And actually, what's already clear is that, in the period in the last decade, Russia has used its resources, its revenues from oil and commodities, etc., to corrupt Western business, Western politics, academia, think tanks. That money's been put to very good use, and there's been a huge lobbying effort by Russian friends to subvert, I guess, the Western response in reaction to the invasion in support of Ukraine, but also to moderate the sanctions impact as well. I mean, many of those voices that we've heard criticizing the Western sanctions response since 2014, since the illegal annexation of Crimea, you have to question their ultimate motives, and a lot of that was driven by the corruption of kleptocracy, of Russian money, dirty money, and not just oligarch money, but state captured, state directed money that has been corrupting our systems from within. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, Putin, it's pretty clear now, he's attacking Ukraine, but he's attacking us, our very system of government. So I think the recognition of that is pretty important. I think now post the invasion over the last year, what we've seen again is, I guess there's this idea, I guess there's a naivety that assumes, Russia does this malign action, we lobby, we impose sanctions, and then Russia doesn't do anything. I mean, the sanctions that Russia kind of expected, maybe not as aggressively, but was preparing these defenses through Fortress Russia. But actually, Russia is constantly trying to get around sanctions, constantly deploying resources again to still achieve its objectives. And people like Brian O'Toole, who's on the call, will know from a sanctions administrator that it's a constant effort, not only designing and rolling them out initially, but keeping them up to scratch, fit for purpose, making sure you counter Russia's continued actions to get around those sanctions. And it's kind of interesting in my mind that if you look at the last year, there's been a lot of focus on the fact that, initially last year we had the spurt in oil prices higher, Russia's current account position strengthened, from a surplus of whatever 50 billion to something like 200 odd billion. So a big net benefit for Russia. Actually, reserves dropped. And what we can see from the numbers, if you assume a big increase in the current account surplus, actually dropping reserves, there was a large amount of capital flight out of Russia. That's the reality, right? Russians did get their money out. You can see it in partner country data. So if you look at the data for Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, particularly Turkey, but also I think the GCC, that's also fairly evident, that Russians have found ways of taking the money out. Turkey's a good example. Turkey, if you look at the errors and emissions data out of Turkey, I mean, they ran a surplus on that unaccountable flow number of about $30 billion last year. The highest it's ever been as an inflow has been something like 16 billion, right? And actually it tends to go plus or minus, right? So a 30 billion inflow is a huge inflow, unexplained. Also, there was also a big increase in the number of Russian tourists coming in, but in the end, probably Turkey got, I would imagine, between 15 and $20 billion of inflows from Russia that are unexplained. Now, some of that will be, let's say, I'm trying to think of a word to explain it, but I'm going to say normal Russians, but Russians who've decided to flee the mobilization or don't like the regime, want to get out, whatever, there'll be some kind of good Russian money leaving the system. But I think a lot of it also will be regime money that is actually looking to park itself overseas, to be used to get around sanctions, to buy critical imports, to be deployed to corrupt governments around the world in their interests. And interestingly, again, if you look at the focus on Turkey, Erdogan himself has a very difficult election coming up May 14th. Obviously, there's now a lot of focus on the earthquake. But Erdogan has been able to run a very unorthodox monetary regime, trying to defend the lira, not increasing interest rates, because he's got those inflows. He's got those inflows from Russia, but also some friendly Gulf administrations. And what is the price that he will pay for taking those monies from Russia to maintain his exchange rate anchor to give him a chance of winning those elections? Is it stalling Sweden and Finland's NATO entry bids? Has that figured at all in Erdogan's decision set about playing hardball particularly with Sweden in terms of its entry? He's clearly dependent on those Russian capital flows and Russian tourism flows, but has that been a factor in his decision essentially to play really hardball with Sweden on its NATO entry? In the end, it's playing to Putin's advantage, right? I mean, the whole reason that Putin is very, very happy that Sweden is not, getting the green light for Erdogan to join the NATO it's a huge win for Putin. It shows division in NATO, and I would argue the suspicion is that the Erdogan administration has been persuaded by those capital flows out of Russia. So I think there needs to be more Western focus, I think, in our sanctions regimes to look at that money that is leaving. Interestingly, in the last 24 hours, there's this FT report about a Russian bank that has got approval, has been given a banking license actually by the UAE government to operate. I mean, now either that is helping and facilitating capital flight out of Russia, which will undermine Russia's sort of balance of payment story. The more capital that leaves, hopefully that will undermine that story. But it could also be helping regime money exit and then, regime money exit and then be deployed in Russian state interests overseas. So I'll end there. I mean, I think we've got a very limited time. No doubt there'll be some Q&As.
Very provocative comments, interesting on Turkey. All right. Brian O'Toole, you were part of the legendary Dan Fried-led sanctions team during the Obama administration. What is your view on the sanctions in place? Are they working? And what more should be done?
I think it's hard to argue sanctions aren't working, right? And a lot of this revolves around what your definition of working is. I'm going to steal a quote from Mike McFall that I heard last week or the week before, where he said, nobody ever says HIMARS aren't working, right? But Putin's still in Ukraine. And so, holding sanctions to a stiffer test than HIMARS is pretty silly, in my opinion. So there's a lot of people who will just say, he's still in Ukraine and therefore sanctions aren't working, which misses the picture entirely. Sanctions are a part of policy, right? And in this case, they're not the front and center of what the impact on Russia needs to be for Ukraine's victory. Ukraine's victory relies on the bravery of the Ukrainian people and the military supplies from the West, primarily, right? Those are the two largest factors by far. Sanctions are a complementary policy that are actually more of a longer term goal, I think, than the war itself, although they do have some impact on the war. So I think undoubtedly sanctions are working, right? Fortress Russia, Tim brings it up. I have my own thoughts on that, namely that Putin since 2014 has sacrificed something on the order of 3% or more annual GDP growth to, build up an extra buffer of about $200 billion in foreign exchange reserves. That is not really a fortress in my view, although it has allowed the state to weather some of the worst impacts of the sanctions alongside the kind of capital controls they imposed early on. So I think, sanctions are having an impact on the Russian economy, full stop. There is zero doubt about that. There is a significant impact. If you look at the, some of the most recent returns, Russian spending is way up to support the war and revenues are down, partially because of the oil price cap and partially because of a soft market, but also because sanctions have an impact on the broader economy. I think there is plenty more to be done. I think what can be done and what should be done are issues that often come up kind of in the moment, right? There's There's a different sanctions response if Russia drops a chemical weapon or a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, right? That takes this to a different place than it is now, as horrific as the atrocities are at the moment. And in the meantime, I think Olena, captured it nicely. The focus has got to be on the evasion, right? Getting the chip exports evasion techniques squashed. This MTS bank thing in the UAE is particularly galling, I think, for the Treasury Department in particular, because Undersecretary Brian Nelson was just in the UAE and Turkey doing a roadshow on cracking down on sanctions evasion. And then as soon as he leaves, the UAE announces this license. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on shoring up, the whack-a-mole game. For those of you who are familiar with the old arcade game where you have to whack a mole, it pops up. That's the game. That's what sanctions are, right? There's a constant kind of tuning and reinforcement. I would expect that to be the primary goal of Western nations at the moment, alongside trying to figure out how to use, and if they can use some of the frozen money or seized money to help rebuild Ukraine or stabilize Ukraine economically, because that's another really critical component, especially with all the energy infrastructure devastation. So that's kind of where I would expect it to go. But some of it will depend a little bit on the kind of stimulus response of what happens in the war itself, and how the world reacts to some of these atrocities.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Look, I have a real task for our panelists. We've got 21 minutes left. I have a round of questions to go. Please try and keep your answers to 2 minutes or less, please. Okay, Mr. Cusack, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project recently issued a report on Kremlin efforts to bribe politicians across Europe. This follows up on comments made by Mr. Ash. How widespread is this Russian practice? In your judgment, how successful have these Russian efforts been? And what do you make of Hungary's Orban asking the EU to lift sanctions on Russian oligarchs? I think you have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Yeah, that's probably a three-part question. So I'm going to answer a bit of that, because otherwise I'm going to take me 10 minutes. As Tim said, look, it's been an open secret that there's been Russian money flowing into many institutions who have taken that money. That doesn't necessarily mean that was corruption. It's kind of legal corruption in my book, as opposed to illegal corruption. But when it comes to politicians taking money from foreign states, I think we're in a completely different order of magnitude there. Back in the day, of course, it used to be left-wing politicians that used to take Russian money, and now it's right-wing politicians. And with the rise of the right and the rise of the extreme right, there's more people out there that want to be associated with, or proponents of similar ideologies. And therefore, to a certain extent, it may not even be bribery in the classic sense. It may be just getting funded for doing things that they think are consistent with their own views. It's certainly a big problem. I mean, the report you mentioned, the money's involved in that. They're not that significant. Much more has been happening over the last 2 decades that Tim was talking about. We talk about real money in those cases. But of course, the Russians are going to infiltrate our political systems, and they're going to bribe, either legally or illegally, no matter, in whichever way they can, to try and get their points across. That's absolutely clear. The one thing I would say is I go back to, I think, the most corrupt of all actions, which was the appointment of Gerhard Schröder in 2005 to run Nord Stream. I mean, he was the one in the German government that made the deal, that gave them the deal, and then went on the board about 3 months later. I mean, that was legal corruption at its worst, and he's made $20 million out of it. So I'd rather focus on that than what we're seeing necessarily today, because I think that had a bigger impact. If you look about where German foreign policy was as a result of that, I think we're all paying the price now.
A trenchant observation. Thank you. All right. Mrs. Halushka, Secretary Blinken and other Western leaders have talked about bringing Russian war criminals to justice. Do you think the West is doing enough to do this? And how do you see this developing?
Well, the problem which we are seeing is that the West does not see the end game in this war. We do not feel that the West is supporting Ukrainian victory. The messages that we will be supporting Ukraine for as long as it is needed are not actually right, because that foresee the support of Ukraine till the very last Ukrainian, as we are dying right now on the front lines, defending entire free world. We need the support as soon as possible and in the amounts which is needed. If we talk about off-ramps or if we talk about peace deals, this is not a message to Russian criminals that they will be brought to accountability. This is the message that they might avoid justice. So for us, it is incredibly important that all of Russian criminals are brought to liability. So this regards obviously those who are implementing atrocities and crimes on the ground. They might be prosecuted either within Ukrainian jurisdiction or with the help of existing international tools like ICC, for example. But there is no instruments to prosecute those who are guilty in the mother of all crimes, which is the crime of aggression, because without it, there would be no deportations, rape, killing of civilians, looting, etc., etc. So it's incredibly important that there is consensus and that there is clear message that the West is, preferably entire world, is supporting the establishment of the tribunal for Russian aggression, which will be the tool to prosecute the three officials that are, according to the international law, have immunity. So the president, the prime minister, and a minister of foreign affairs. That's one of the priorities of my organization. And as we see, that's the only way how we can break the vicious circle of this never-ending aggressions of Russia, Ichkeria, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, right now, again, full-scale genocide. It won't stop if there is no accountability.
Thank you very much. And I agree with your criticism of what I call the timidity of American policy and other NATO member policy in arming Ukraine. Okay. Mr. Ash, besides sanctions of Russian individuals, firms, and banks, many nations have frozen Russian oligarch and state assets. Canada has passed a law that would empower it to transfer those assets to Ukraine. Such legislation regarding Russian states' assets is also under consideration in the US Congress. Some critics think that this might undermine the international financial system and lead to the emergence of an alternate system underwritten by China. Others point out that this was done with Iraq's assets after it invaded Kuwait, and doubt that many states would entrust their assets to a system controlled by Beijing. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I really don't get this at all. I don't get it in terms of someone's blocking it. It should be done. Someone's blocking it. I think it's US Treasury and UK Treasury that just can't think outside the box. The facts are this, Russia has obviously conducted a huge war of aggression and destruction on Ukraine, right? And there's lots of calculations about the cost, but somewhere between $500 billion and $1 trillion. As important as winning the war will be winning the peace and making sure Ukraine's reconstruction is successful. The reality is, who's going to pay between $500 billion and $1 trillion for the reconstruction? Western taxpayers are not going to pay it. Ukraine will not have market access to finance that kind of reconstruction. And you've got $400 billion of frozen assets, right? That's just there, frozen assets from the aggressor. Now, the argument against it is this argument, well, if we do it, we set a precedent, it's attacking private property rights. Sorry, complete and utter bull. Firstly, I would argue the precedent has already been set. The assets have been frozen. The message to China and Saudi Arabia that have assets in the West, the message is, well, they're at risk already because of the action of freezing the assets, which I obviously supported. But actually, the message should be, and it should be crystal clear, there are consequences for conducting genocide and war crimes against countries, going against international law and invading countries. And it's crystal clear. The country that is attacking and destroying private property rights is Russia in Ukraine, right? So, I think it's a small mindset living in a different parallel universe and not reality. And I think it needs to be done. It has to be done. And they just need to basically pull the finger out and do it. And I just think this private property right argument is just ridiculous, frankly. Anyway, I think I've said my piece there.
That was very eloquent. Thank you. Okay, Brian, we're up to you. The last question before we turn to the audience. We have reports of Chinese help for Russia with the export of tech components that may also have military application. What more needs to be done to stop this flow? And more broadly, what should be done to deal with other countries that may be helping Russia avoid the full impact of sanctions?
Yeah, first, I do want to challenge Tim a little bit on his blaming of the U.S. Treasury and others. I won't speak to Canada or the UK or other jurisdictions, but in the United States, there is simply no legal mechanism to do this right now. They can, the assets are not frozen, they are restricted. And while these are semantic issues for, I think, a goal where everybody agrees that Russia does need to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction, from a legal basis, they matter. The funds are not frozen, they are restricted, and they still are property of the Russian central bank. And the US cannot simply say, okay, now they belong to Ukraine. There are no legal mechanisms to do that under the current legal structure in the United States, full stop. So that's the issue on the US side. And I don't disagree with Tim on the end goal that these funds need to be used for reconstruction, but they've got to be done in a way that respects a fundamental basis and underpinning of the U.S. economy, which is property rights. And those things make a big difference. It's one of the reasons why capital flows into the United States and is a huge economic advantage. There are strong property rights here. So those things need to be worked out, and there's a needle to thread there, and I think that needs to happen. But we can't just suspend property rights because of even as heinous as Russia's actions are, there are other issues at play here. So setting that aside, in terms of how you crack down on some of these things moving forward, look, there are financial sanctions for the ways that Russia is avoiding kind of the financial sanctions on its banks and oligarchs and things like that. Those are relatively well understood in the global markets, right? Banks understand these things. There are choke points the US can take advantage of. I think the bigger challenge over the next year or two is going to be the export controls, which are extremely powerful and wide-ranging, but also novel and untested. So what Commerce has done in imposing this foreign direct product rule on Russia is something that I don't think a lot of US businesses understand, let alone kind of Chinese re-exporters or others. So I think there's going to be a long back and forth involving not just diplomacy, but also Commerce Department enforcement actions. One of the things that kind of flies under the radar is Commerce, just prior to the Russian invasion, actually revised its enforcement authorities to give itself more flexibility, more akin to what OFAC does with enforcement. And so I would expect a series of enforcement actions by the Commerce Department that are being published, that would be publicized to kind of promote compliance by others, coupled with strong diplomacy, right? They're going to have, this should have been something that Secretary Blinken was speaking about in China with his counterparts, had that trip not been canceled. So that's not going to fall to Ambassador Burns. But all around the world, these conversations are going to need to happen at both a political and a technical level to really get it done.
Okay, thank you. Let me just make one point here. There is serious consideration of legislation in Congress that would enable to go after those assets, but we'll see what happens with that legislation. All right, we have audience questions. We have a series of questions from Jack K relating to identifying and dealing with black and gray markets regarding sanctions. Does anyone want to take this on? We've already had some discussion of this, but maybe some additional detail.
I mean, John, I can jump in quickly.
Please.
Again. I think this is the whack-a-mole game, right? Sanctions evasion can happen, right? It's costly, it drives up prices, it's less efficient than market trade, but it happens, right? North Korea is still moving weapons, parts, around, and things like that. So what this comes down to is just a focus on enforcement and implementation by Western nations. The U.S. does this pretty well. Others don't. To be frank, it's not something that the EU has a lot of capabilities in. If you think about some of the member state capacity, it's just not there. The U.S. has a whole apparatus around this. The UK is getting there, although they're still far behind. The EU is farther behind than the UK. So it needs to be a real focus of Western nations.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, I think, for Tim Ash. It's from Eon Kavanaugh. He says, related to Mr. Ash's comments, since the 2000s, European banking groups aspiring to grow internationally saw Putin's Russia as an easy and profitable opportunity. Often many well-connected Russian nationals and nationals of ex-Warsaw Pact countries were headhunted to help grow this business. Among the people hired purely on merit, there was also a strong network of Kremlin facilitators who've now been positioned in multiple European financial institutions for decades. How can such malign actors, people who often made huge profits for their employers in the past, now be vetted, especially before they reinvent themselves as experts on investments in rebuilding Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have highlighted this in the past. So I work for an asset manager, right? So we're kind of investors, right? So I was always amazed for many years as a sort of Kremlin watcher, relatively hawkish on Russia and Putin, that most of the research I got from the sell side, from banks, was written by Russian analysts, right, in Moscow, right? And it pained me that very often, reading between the lines, the messaging was relatively benign towards Russia, right, and very, not very critical,
right?
And that certainly worried me. Now, I'm not casting dispersions against any of the particular analysts, but it's a shame that the management of some of the Western financial institutions, didn't think a little bit, more clearly in terms of the messaging they were giving to markets. And I think, actually, interestingly, one reason that initially the market seemed to be so surprised by Russia's invasion, its invasion of Ukraine in February last year. Obviously, it invaded earlier in 2014, but the large-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was, I think, the messaging they got was totally distorted by some of the sell-side research they were reading and broader research. So, look, I agree that, Russian money, Russian capital has corrupted business, academia, the city, the city of London. I mean, all the money that came through, doing the deal was more important for many people than actually, defending our system of governance, right? And that's kind of disappointing. I'll end it there, actually, before I go ranting about it a bit even more.
Thank you. Okay. A question from Christian Marcel Fillet. Forgive me if I mispronounced the last name. There was talk of Turkey, but Orban's Hungary also openly supports Putin's Russia and keeps Sweden for now at NATO's door. Any comments about the role of Orban in Hungary? No takers?
Well, the role of Orban, basically? I don't mind. I mean, look, I mentioned Turkey earlier and Russia's success. I mean, Hungary is another example of that, I think, right? I mean, a case where Russian money and influence has been put to work very effectively. I don't get Orban. I don't get his, if you go back to 20, 30 years, the origins of Fidesz, Hungary, I mean, 56, I just don't get the pro-Russian sympathies there, given, Hungary's own experience at the hands of Moscow. But, I wonder where the relationship between Orban and Putin started, really.
I do think the one thing that the West has in Hungary, leverage over Hungary that it doesn't have over Turkey is that Hungary is desperate for EU financing. And, as a member of the EU, there is that counterweight there that doesn't necessarily apply to Turkey, where Erdogan has, is famous for playing everybody off of each other, right? That's kind of his thing. And so Orban has fewer tools than Turkey, and so there are ways to kind of mitigate some of the malign influence there in a way that just doesn't exist with Ankara.
Brian, do you think that the EU is willing to play hardball with this?
I think the EU has been playing hardball a little bit with Orban already. I think there are indications that they've threatened aid, they have threatened the voting rights, given the backsliding of democracy.
Right, on democracy, but now we're talking about on the Putin problem.
Yeah, my understanding is the aid has been, maybe, I don't know if explicitly threatened, but it certainly comes up in a lot of these discussions that we have about these issues. And so I don't think that kind of facet is lost on Orban in Hungary. Now, it has limited utility, of course, but the EU was able to put in place sanctions on Russia, despite opposition theoretically from Orban, given the corrupting influence of Russian money there. And so there's, there are counterweights there that just do not exist with Turkey.
Thank you, John. Do you want to jump on this too?
No, I was only just going to mention actually that Europe had its own troubles with corruption recently, with allegations out of Qatar, which gave a real own goal to the Europeans versus Hungary. Right? I mean, Hungary, can easily respond back to the allegations that it receives money from autocratic states and is undemocratic, and then of course a huge own goal for the EU. Doesn't mean the EU is not in the right place, but that was a real shame.
Good enough. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I think, Liana, this is for you. It's from an anonymous attendee. Does the current corruption scandal in the Ukrainian government undermine efforts to stop dirty Russian money laundering? Was the scandal an active measure carried out by the terrorist state, or was it just greed on the part of government officials, or was it even greed?
I'm commenting on the recent corruption scandals, basically from the perspective that not all of the partners explicitly see, but the fact how the system, how the authorities are dealing with this corruption scandals, they show that Ukraine is a maturing democracy, that our anti-corruption institutions are operational even while the country is fighting against a full-scale genocidal war. Our anti-corruption activists and our investigative journalists continue to do watchdogging, even again working in this wartime circumstances. But does it mean that despite the fact that since 2014 we have achieved a lot in terms of fighting against corruption, that corruption does not exist anymore in Ukraine? No, unfortunately. That is why I don't think that corruption scandals anyhow undermine the Western assistance for Ukraine, because that's on the contrary, the sign that the country continues changing and that the country continues and keeps democratic transformation despite everything.
The last word is yours. Thank you very much, Ms. Halushka. Thank everyone for tuning in. We appreciate the great contribution by our panelists and, of course, by Minister Marchenko. We'll be doing more on this subject in the future. Please pay attention. Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.